I'm really, really delighted to welcome two of our esteemed speakers. Actually, Julie was saying when she got here this morning, it's fine now the entourage that came behind her, like the VIPs are here now, so that you know that today is going to go really well. It's really important to have these two papers on continuities and change in British Conservative women's policies and practice from these esteemed historians, and to hear them addressing some of the themes around conservatism and feminism, especially in light of some of the debate that Julie's going to talk about in utilising the past to facilitate our understanding of right-leaning female leaders today. There is much less work on academic work on conservative women and even Thatcher, and bridging this gap is really important at this time. We need the tools to understand women like Liz Truss, Marine Le Pen. We need to understand Kemi Badenoch, Priti Patel, and it's the role of historians to provide these tools. Julie and Clarisse have published together extensively on right-leaning women, and they're about to publish a volume on the history of right-wing women and social action from a European perspective, which is the first comparison of women on the right of politics across Europe, women on the right in modern Europe, politics and public action in comparative and transnational perspective. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce Julie Gottlieb, who's Professor of Modern British History at the University of Sheffield. She has published extensively on women's political history between the wars, including feminine fascism, women in British fascist movement, 1923 to 1945, and guilty women, gender and appeasement in interwar Britain. And she's currently working on a study of the War of Nerves and an apparent epidemic of war-triggered suicides in Britain on the eve of the Second World War. Clarisse Berthezene is Professor of Modern British History at the University of Paris City. She has published extensively on the history of conservatism, including Training Minds for the War of Ideas, Ashridge College, the Conservative Party and the Cultural Politics of Britain, 1929 to 1954, and she's currently the principal investigator of a European cost project entitled Who Cares in Europe, which is developing an emerging field of research exploring the relationships between voluntary associations, families and states in the creation of social welfare in Europe. She's also working on the political mobilisation of conservative women in the period from 1918 to 1990 and the links between gender, politics and voluntary action. So because we're having them in dialogue, we've asked Julie and Clarisse to speak for about 15 minutes each, and after which we will have 15 minutes we'll have longer than that, for discussion and questions from the audience. And Julie's going to speak mainly about nationalist feminism from a historical perspective, and Clarisse is going to speak drawing mainly from her most recent research on conservative women and voluntarism. So if you join me in thanking them very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Here's my clicker. Thank you for that generous introduction, Lyndsey, and of course for inviting us in the first place. It's a real pleasure and a delight to be here with all of you. And of course, everything that we say has much more kind of immediate significance than when we were first invited. So I'll hopefully address some of those very present resonances. Margaret Thatcher famously said that feminism was a poison, and she had disassociated herself from the women's liberation movement as much as that jarred with her glass ceiling breaking achievement to become Britain's first female Prime Minister. Thatcher's response to feminism is not the only measure, though, of the lengths that conservatives have gone to align themselves with sexual equality agendas, however. Certainly, in the 21st century, from 2016 to 2019, under the leadership of Britain's second Tory woman Prime Minister, and with the spotlight on the celebrations of the centenary of women's partial enfranchisement in 2018, under the leadership of Britain's second Tory Prime Minister, and then in 2019, with the Astor 100 project. Feminism, at all of these moments and in these phases, feminism has been adapted and kind of repurposed to suit the Conservative Party's public image and its ideology. As of a week ago, an absolute whirlwind of a week that no one could have anticipated, the third woman Conservative Prime Minister, Liz Truss, is now on the scene, and we're starting to get faint glimpses of her version of feminism and how this may inform her policies and style of leadership. Yet despite the fact that Truss was Minister for Women and Equalities since 2019, her identification with feminist politics is, well, shall we say, lukewarm at best, and verging on contemptuous in certain aspects at its worst. When interviewed in March 2021 by the House, it became clear that under her watch you can't find women's policies specifically being developed, and she's already hit out at pink bus feminism. There won't be quotas or all-female shortlists for anything. She's also stopped unconscious bias training amongst the civil service, saying it's not useful in improving equality. She's previously described herself as a Destiny's Child feminist, which was already referred to yesterday in Laura's wonderful presentation. To carry on, one who believes women should be independent. She makes the case for conservative feminism. That term is going to be very important for me in what follows. Centering on freedom that will in turn lead to empowerment, and it's clear many of her views were crystallized in her early teens. Truss is, in fact, more of a trailblazer in having served as Foreign Secretary, the second woman in that post and the first Conservative woman in that post, and in a sphere of politics, let's remember, that has always been much more stubbornly male-identified. Now, what I'd like to explore further today is this so-called conservative feminism that Truss has referred to. I want to trace its intellectual genealogy and its embodied lineage. Now, the purpose of doing so is to develop what I hope is a more nuanced understanding of women's political engagement on the right and a process of gendering British conservatism. Now, these are the questions that I'm going to be focusing on. How do we explain women's success in ascending the ranks of conservative politics? Do we need to move away from a binary of left progressivism and versus right-wing reaction when it comes to opportunities and agendas of equality for women? Can we agree that there is a long tradition of Tory feminism? Other options, other terminologies that we could use here that are not quite interchangeable, but I might be using them at various times. We could talk about conservative feminism, nationalist feminism, patriotic feminism. I also, of course, have to emphasize that in identifying these strains and identifying these kind of formulas and these ideological coming to terms, there's no sense that I'm endorsing them or celebrating them, but you'll see, and they will come much more in the discussion, how important it is to definitely study them and be open to understanding these processes. Okay, so indeed, the origins of the current phenomenon is not to be found in Thatcher's Britain in the 1980s, but rather further back in the first part of the 20th century. The blending of modern conservatism with modern feminism can be traced back to when a minority of conservative and unionist women supported women's suffrage in the Edwardian period, and they organized accordingly, through to the mobilization of patriotic and nationalist women during the First World War, and then during the interwar period, as the party began to feast on the electoral fruits of women's franchise. Now, you'll be probably less surprised by these kind of hybrid positions after the very nuanced talk given by, in conversation with Caroline Slowcock yesterday. We saw her willingness, as someone who was not at all pro-Thatcher ideologically, her willingness to see the humanity and humanness of a woman politician and kind of place her in that context on the basis of kind of their shared gender identity, despite their ideological differences. So you'll possibly think very much in terms of that kind of psychological coming to terms as a good way of kind of framing this discussion. Okay. I'm not sure why okay, sorry, there was some crossover there with the, right. Certainly the present-day Conservative Party has celebrated the history of British feminism, at least a particular strain of British feminism. A good illustration of this is the rescue and the revamping of the history of conservative feminism in the present-day Conservative Women's Organization and on their website. On its history tab, it featured Emmeline Pankhurst, Emily Wheeling Davison, Dorothy Bryant, and Elsie Bowerman. Of these, Davison was not an active Tory, but one presumes that she's been selected to kind of fly the flag or to signal admiration and fascination with the militant women's suffrage campaigners. Emmeline Pankhurst, leader of the Militant Women's Social and Political Union, was a later convert to Toryism and a prospective parliamentary candidate representing Baldwin's Conservative Party upon her death in 1927. Although, together with her favoured daughter Christabel, her political path from Labourism to Baldwinian conservatism was incremental rather than sudden. Dorothy Bryant, another of these kind of poster women for the present-day CWO, was a party activist, and she provides, I think, a model for women's voluntarism, as well as a path to women's professionalization within the party. Although otherwise, I hadn't ever really heard much about Bryant, as probably many of you haven't as well. She's not a particularly distinct or outspoken figure or on any issues, and feminist ones certainly not either. Elsie Bowerman's more interesting, I think. She led a varied life as a suffragette, an internationalist, and a leading figure in the conservative-affiliated Voluntary Association, including the Women's Guild of Empire and the Women's Voluntary Service. And she did, but nonetheless, she doesn't figure as a prominent, historical subject, other than in very specialized or specialist kind of histories. So, sorry, I'll go back to that for a sec. It's striking the way that the contemporary CWO then chose to spotlight these women, most of whom had a healthy suffrage pedigree and a radical one at that. So they're leaders, they are chosen because they are definitely leaders and prominent figures within the law-breaking suffragettes. So a presentist agenda and a healthy dose of revisionism really explains, I think, the assembly of these women for the CWO's pantheon. These historic women, these exemplars, they support the Conservative Party in their construction of a partly imagined feminist past and make gestures towards a feminist-informed Tory future, premised, I think, upon kind of a general consensus about the unmitigated good of both gender equality as a fundamental national and British value. And the harnessing of women's activism, on the other hand, and candidature to boost the electoral fortunes of the party. Indeed, the high-profile and public-facing campaign Women to Win, established in 2005 by Anne Jenkins, no relation, of course. There's another with our wonderful chair, and Theresa May, has likewise been eager to what I would say backfill the party's historic feminist credentials. Women to Win has worked across party lines and shared a platform with women from all parties, the campaigning organization 50-50 Parliament, who we heard from yesterday, the Ask Her to Stand campaign, the Centenary Project Vote 100, and the membership charity, the Fawcett Society. It is similarly instructive to look at the present-day reputation of Edith Lady Londonderry. While she was never an MP, she was a leading Tory hostess of her day. She was hyperactive in the establishment of women's national service initiatives, and she was a significant back channels operator in both domestic and especially foreign relations with Nazi Germany by the 1930s. Indeed, in the context of this kind of what I'm trying to say, this malleability of memory and this hankering of the heritage industry for kind of well-born feminists, should we say, it's significant how the National Trust celebrated the suffrage centenary in 2018. At Mount Stewart, particularly. Why Mount Stewart? Because Mount Stewart is the family seat of the Londonderrys in County Down, Northern Ireland. And as they put it, to mark this historic moment, we'll be celebrating the lives and legacies of women who made our place special. At Mount Stewart, our focus will be on the women of the Londonderry family, whilst exploring perceptions of power. So despite Londonderry's very mixed record in the 1930s, the National Trust didn't have many qualms about celebrating her. Okay. With the what is the Conservative Women's Organization, and to a lesser extent the National Trust, what are they really praising? What are they embracing? What kind of refashioning and appropriation are they involved with here in kind of embracing these women and trying to make sense of their political careers? So I think the balance that is struck, and the one that is fundamental to this political frame, is between women's rebelliousness and national service. And their dowdy and dogged feminine determination to be permitted to perform women's duties. And duty is going to be fundamental here. Another important strand is voluntarism and mobilizing women's auxiliary service, as these women are not only involved in the inner life of the party or merely cogs in the electoral machine. Indeed, the generation of conservative and right-wing women who are the focus of my research in the first part of the 20th century stand out for their independence, their enacting and their embodiment of sexual equality, their dedication to national service, and a spirit of voluntarism. All characteristics that were made compatible with their patriotism and conservative ideology. So I'm going to offer you, in the discussion that continues, two examples to kind of illustrate this. And I'm going to speak a bit about the aforementioned Lady Londonderry and also about Flora Drummond, because I think both of them personified this attempted merger between feminism and conservatism. All right, so as I've already referred to Lady Londonderry, I'm going to continue speaking about her. So Edith Lady Londonderry worked at the heart of the establishment and at the epicenter of the Conservative Party. Londonderry was born into and then married into the social elite of the Conservative Party, but she was also had a more radical edge, which was signaled by her involvement in the Tory suffrage campaign. She combined a vision of sexual equality with fantasies about women's Amazonian potential, as well as a kind of hyperactive and hyper-patriotic language that combined with a distinguished record of voluntary service, made possible, of course, by her wealth, her aristocratic status, her access to political and cultural leaders of the nation. She was a staunch and active supporter of women's suffrage. She spoke on the platforms of the Conservative and Women's Franchise Association. When war broke out in 1914, Lady Londonderry established the Women's Voluntary Reserve, later called the Women's Legion, and she acted as its president. Now, it's its ethos here, which is a vivid illustration of nationalist feminism, the ethos of the Women's Legion. The reserve crystallizes into outward form the ardent patriotism of women and gives them a distinct place in the service of the state, apart from all philanthropy. The attainment of physical fitness becomes a patriotic duty, and it is made possible by the provision of drills and military uniform. As she put it, quote, "The spirit which inspired the movement found expression in voluntary service and discipline." So what were women to do there? They were trained to be ready for any emergency. They prepared with regular drilling, physical training, and lessons in first aid and nursing. They also provided service, the service of kind of moral intervention. For instance, setting up soft drinks canteens in big munitions factories, and they were the extended arm of the temperance movement in this sense. The Women's Legion established a mechanical transport section in 1916. Members drove for the Army Service Corps throughout the war, and it was the only corps of women to serve directly under the War Department. So her organization participated in the Women's March in front of Buckingham Palace at the end of June 1918 in a parade of women war workers of every hue, paid and voluntary. All right, so what is interesting here is that she established the Women's Legion, or re-established the Women's Legion in 1934 in anticipation of another national emergency, while simultaneously she was definitely well placed socially and ideologically to press for Anglo-German understanding. And with her husband, she was one of the most unbending appeasers. So in the case of Londonderry, her access to power was preordained, while her response to feminism was more, well, counterintuitive. We're not surprised by her voluntary service. We're not surprised about what she was able to do, but we are, I think, more surprised that she was so embracing of feminism. She didn't need feminism to realize her political ambitions, but nonetheless, this is something that drew her. Okay, so as I say, she is kind of national service feminism personified. Now, other than being born in the same year, 1878, Londonderry and Flora Drummond couldn't have been more different. They were from opposite backgrounds, if you like. Flora Drummond was from a working class family in Scotland. She grew up in Lancashire. She joined the Labour Party. She studied economics at university, but I think without taking a degree. She was a social worker, and she joined the Pankhurst WSPU. In almost every way, she's Londonderry's opposite. Drummond was also imprisoned 9 times for her suffragette militant acts. So her rightward turn began in the First World War. By 1917, Drummond was saying that the most important work for women was resisting pacifism and pro-German intrigue, especially in the great centers of war industry. Backing up words with deeds by traveling to the Clyde side to break strikes. Together with Emmeline Pankhurst and Christabel Pankhurst and Annie Kenney, of course. We have Annie Kenney's great biographer as our chair. Flora Drummond dominated the short-lived Women's Party. In 1918, with the above, she was one of the signatories of the Manifesto of the Women's Party, the new incarnation of the WSPU, whose slogan was Victory, National Security and Progress. The Women's Party called for Britain for the British, for the British Empire to be strengthened, for the union between Ireland and the rest of the British Isles to be maintained in view of the German peril, and for increased production of wealth to be made a primary object by all engaged in industry. So the distance traveled from their left-wing roots couldn't be more stark. Of these issues that were feminist rather than ultranationalist and anti-union, the Women's Party outlined special women's questions, including equal pay for equal work, equal marriage laws, equal parental rights, raising the age of consent, and equality of rights and responsibilities in regard to the social and political service of the nation. So what I've just mentioned, these features are a really valuable preview of the formula for this kind of nationalist feminism. All right, in 1919, Drummond went to form the Women's League of Empire with Elsie Bowerman, who I mentioned earlier, and it sought to mobilize working class women, especially their patriotic service, to counter the appeal of communism. So it's a very anti-red organization. Its name gives a lot away, I think. The Women's Guild of Empire claimed to have had a membership of 40,000 members and more than 30 branches in its peak. And she was nicknamed the General for her organizing ability, for her martial appearance and determination, or more negatively, she was called the Precocious Piglet for less flattering reasons. Okay. With the Second World War imminent, Drummond had perfected the nationalist feminist formula, describing the responsibility of women as very grave. Despondent that women's vote had led to only modest reforms for women and children, and describing politics as women's bread and butter. If politics meddle with us, we do have to do something about it. And she worked alongside the Conservative Party in all of this. All right, I'm not going to. I could say a little bit more about Drummond, but I'll move on now to the reason why I think this comparative biography is illustrative. The comparative biographical frame allows us to formulate questions that are relevant, I think, to the longer history of conservative women. So the questions that we're trying to tease out here, can conservative women be feminists? How is national feminism in place to support the politicization of women on the right? What are the core features of this conservative feminism? While their social milieu and their private lives were very different, what these women and the organizations they conceived had in common was this cultivation and this performance, if you like, of a nationalist and ultra-nationalist feminism. And I think on the basis of that and of other research, looking at other figures, other organizations, I think we can probably draw up, or I'd like to propose that we can draw up, a kind of nationalist feminist minimum, so to speak. And I hope that this could have more kind of general, conceptual, meaning and utility as we try to understand what seems like that counterintuitive merger between feminism and conservatism. And these are what I have identified as certainly some of the main features. And I've talked about them specifically in the case of London, Derry, and Drummond, and I won't kind of recite them all, but they are here as kind of key features, key bullet points. Sorry, I'm almost finished. I just want to. Yeah, indeed, I think those were features that are more specific to the early part of the 20th century. But one could develop, I think, a taxonomy of Tory feminism that applies to a longer time span, with origins in the Edwardian period, but with features that are still familiar and echo today. At this time of writing, particularly when a third conservative woman prime minister is really leaning on the vocabulary and the imagery of what I'm trying to identify here. So of those features that cross time and to some extent space, they would be, again, the really fundamental importance of a discourse of duties over rights, that why women are in politics and why we need women in politics is not in order to realize their rights, but so that they can perform their national service, they can perform their duties. There is an underlying discourse of equal but different, and that women have special qualities, a highly essentialized and gendered idea about women's place and their need in political life. There's a focus not so much on sisterhood, but on exceptional women, which is starkly illustrated in the case of Margaret Thatcher, but there are elements of that in other branches in other kind of moments of conservative women's politics. And the stress, I think, and the fourth point here is how women are there to protect vulnerable women. Again, it's not about seeking equality or as a fundamental. It's that women are kind of an extension of conservative patriarchy and paternalism, and that women can actually, be responsible for that, or that they can realize these things. All right, so as a tentative conclusion, and before I pass the baton on to my very wonderful colleague and collaborator, Professor Clarisse Berthezene, both political events and the continued momentum of women's success and promotion in the Conservative Party and in government make coming to grips with conservative feminism, I think, particularly timely and urgent. We're still in search of explanations for the score of Tory women PMs 3, Labour leaders 0. And hopefully thinking about this can help us understand that better. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'll just quickly pick up where Julie left off with reflections on the possible specificities of conservative feminism and this idea of upholding the gender hierarchy. These are questions that were raised also yesterday by Laura Beers and others on conservative women in politics and the lack of work today in this field. And while it's improved, it's true that I've noticed that a lot of the journalists' questions always come back to the same idea that these women seem to emerge from a political vacuum, that if you look at Thatcher and then even today, Truss and before her May, there's little explanations as to where they come from, and we have few tools to understand the phenomenon. And it's even more striking at the European level, and in France there's very little to understand Marine Le Pen and where she comes from and why she calls herself a feminist and why she says that she's rallying women around her. And so there is a need, I think, for more studies, and I call to all of you who are here today, in this field, because we do need to understand what these women are about. And there are many conservative but also right-wing, far right-wing women now in power in Europe everywhere. And it's absolutely, I think, key to understand how they navigate agency in these movements. So today, to come back to Britain and Julie's characterizations, I think that because conservative women propose a female identity based on traditionalism, and Julie was saying gender complementarity, duty over rights, all of these elements that we saw at the end, which I think are very true, but they seem to lead to a sort of misconception that what's implied is that these conservative women were often passive or compliant participants, always bound to traditional roles. And that's, in fact, I think, in the historiography in particular, became a little tricky because they were seen as being exploited by the Conservative Party in the interwar period in particular, after the Second World War. And historians have contributed to this notion that perhaps, in fact, these women, while they've maybe been instrumentalized by the Conservative Party for certain purposes, were passive and, in fact, just sort of bowing to the hierarchy and not having any particular role. So I think that precisely what Julie was saying today is that there were women in that period who actually had a role. And what I'd like to show is that, in fact, there's a vast majority of those conservative women who were very active and who were, in fact, very instrumental in shaping the nature and the appeal of conservatism and the Conservative Party. So there's a very large historiography on how the Conservative Party actually mobilized women from the 19th century onwards, so before the suffrage and after the suffrage, and was very successful as that they, the Conservative Party actually managed to, alongside the working class vote in the 20th century, also obtain the women's vote, and in fact, they used, or they were very successful in having women play a very important role in the party's transformation from an elite to a mass democratic party. And so from the 20s onwards, I'm just going to go that very, very, very briefly, they provided classes for these women, for women speakers. They provided courses for them in economics and the empire, and so there's a whole training moment in the 20s and 30s for these women. And this goes back to what Farah Hussein was saying yesterday, and I was thinking about that. There is a networking between these conservative women early on, and the reinvention, as it were, of the Conservative Party in the 20th century, once again from being a very elite party to a mass democratic party, owes a lot to these women who were part of the party's hierarchy, but more so, it's true, part of its social activities, and in particular its civic associations that emerged during the First World War and flourished in the interwar period. And the Conservative Party was very particularly good at tapping into the vast reservoir of women working in voluntary services, especially non-partisan voluntary services, that's what they usually were, and yet having conservative women from the Conservative Party actually infiltrate, as it were, these associations and use them to their, to their own ends. So in the end, the development of these very highly political yet non-party associations is a very remarkable phenomenon in the 1930s, and created a need, an urge to educate these women in political discourse and action. We can come back to all of that if you're interested. What I thought I'd do is examine two particular episodes right now in the time that I have that I find interesting to understand how these women were actually instrumental themselves and very active and had an agenda and were not just these passive traditionalists stuck in, instrumentalized by the Conservative Party. So after the Second World War, I'm jumping to the Second World War. After the Second World War, there were several debates about these women's organizations and about voluntarism and the state. The relationship between voluntarism and the state had been in debate since at least the turn of the 20th century, but the 40s and 50s were marked by more intense debate about the nature and extent of the voluntary social service movement in light of the creation of the welfare state and the idea of a more statist organization of welfare. The Conservatives, the Conservative Party was actually very concerned that they were adamant that it was key to keep what they call the voluntary spirit alive, voluntarism being essentially a badge of citizenship and a badge of, and for Conservatives, key to the education of citizens. So there were many questions about the expansion of state welfare provision, and would it rely on the involvement of volunteers, and how would that, how would the two sort of combine, and would the role of voluntary action just, would it disappear? So many within the Conservative Party were concerned or even appalled by the possible disappearance of voluntary service. And now what's interesting, I want to take just one example, but so there's a long debate from essentially 1945 to 1950. Many voluntary associations are involved. The debate takes place in the House of Commons in Parliament, and then it ends in the House of Lords in 1949. And so there's during that debate, one of the very large association was the Women's Voluntary Services that had been set up in 1938 by Lady Reading at the request of the Home Office, and which provided support for the social needs of the population throughout the war, and which was in part funded by the state. It was a very large association, which was meant to be non-partisan, but if you look at the people who actually worked there, they're all part of the Conservative Party as well. So these women, a majority of them are in fact Conservative women, holding the reins of this independent organization for civil defense during the Second World War. Now, for the Conservative Party, the WVS, the Women's Voluntary Service, was extremely important because of its national coverage. It was key for the Conservative Party's strategy within the associational world. I would say of infiltration. The word is maybe a bit too strong, but of really sort of getting it everywhere in Britain. So, and they had been, as I said, very successful in doing that in the interwar period. So the question was what was going to happen to the women's voluntary services after the war? Would the Labour Party just sort of get rid of it and replace it altogether? And that would that was obviously problematic. So the debate was ongoing. And was pretty heated, what I find remarkable is how Lady Reading and all these women at the head of the Women's Voluntary Services defended their association. And the way they defended it, the arguments they made, are all about how modern and how what they represent is the new kind of volunteering adapted to the needs of the modern welfare state, providing an effective intermediary body to transform the government's objectives into local action. And so discussing it with the men inside the Conservative Party, they actually argued that they would be able to win this battle and turn the Women's Voluntary Service from a voluntary organization financed by the state to a state service furnished by volunteers, which would be acceptable to the Labour Party, that's how they saw it, and to this new model. So they reworked the relationship between their association and the state, and the fight in Parliament sees them, arguing that they have no committees, that they are more efficient, that, I quote, they are much more modern than the hit and miss old world charitable voluntary service conception, that charity and patronage were past, they said, and that the time was ripe for a new type of voluntary activity. So this is just one example of how, in fact, they reassured many within the Conservative Party that it would be possible to show this in a completely new light. And in fact, in 1949, when the debate took place at the House of Lords, the last debate initiated by Lord Samuel, it was decided that the women's voluntary services would not only remain, they wouldn't sort of shut down, but actually that they would get more funding, whereas other associations had been sort of discarded. So they were very successful in fact, continuing till today this particular voluntary association. So it's one example. Now, the second episode I just want to look at will make us jump to the 1970s. And I just want to say a few words this time, not about a voluntary association, but about the Conservative Women's Organization, so women within the Conservative Party, the women's section of the Conservative Party, which was then called the Women's National Advisory Committee. This committee had been created in 1928, and it was an organization that by the 70s had more or less, it's hard to come by figures, 250,000 members. So that means it's an extremely large organization of women. It's one of the largest in Europe. And what's interesting is in the 70s, they're very assertive, gendered conservative identity, and they talk about conservative feminism. Now, initially, when it was created in 1928, the point of the Central Women's Advisory Committee was mostly not to antagonize the male members of the party, to show who they were, to sort of make sure that they were accepted. But even then, their view was that, and I quote, motherhood was not an insurmountable barrier to reaching the top. And they created many subcommittees to make sure that, and I quote, that they would take part in the formulation of policy of special interest to women. So they always had women's causes, obviously, at heart, and they were trying to play a role within the Conservative Party, which was obviously very male-dominated at the time. There's this book by Denise Condiotti. It's mostly on women in Turkey, and so it's a different context, but she talks about patriarchal bargaining and how when you're faced with a very patriarchal hierarchy, you have to find other strategies than just sort of move forward and present your goals. You have to probably uphold the hierarchy that's there and actually play around it. And it seems to me that it works for these women, and I think it's quite appropriate in those years. Now, towards the end of the 60s, we're in a different context, and under the vice chairmanship of Sarah Morrison, they became much more vocal. And the Women's National Advisory Committee started campaigning for women's rights alongside the women's liberation movement. They went to the Women's Liberation Movement Conference. They defended women's rights, wrote papers on sex discrimination. They actually attacked their own party in a paper on saying that they were being discriminated against. So these were the first sort of signs that this women's committee was taking a more radical turn. They played a significant role in the campaign for equal opportunity and employment, and they recognized, of course, that childcare, was absolutely key, was needed, and it could be an obstacle for women entering employment, etc. Now, one of the paradoxes is that it's really in the 60s and 70s that the cliche of Tory women being, fundraising, sandwich making, envelope filling ladies was reached its peak, really. They were both sort of ridiculed in the papers, in the press. They were objects of laughter. MP Julian Critchley, the Conservative MP, described them as the Tory women, conjures up pictures of tweedy women with cut glass voices, towed by Labradors, comfortable middle-aged bodies in unspeakable hats who sit cheerfully knitting through the roadiest of debates. And the press was particularly unkind, so to the point that the Conservative Party actually convened with these women to actually discuss the fact that they were damaging the party's image. And there was they were saying that, one major impediment to the use of the Women's Conference as a medium for projecting the party image is the women themselves. The chairman noted, that there is a need to change our ladies' images, and it really relates to what Caroline Slocok was saying yesterday about having their haircut and having those shoulder pads. The hats became a problem. The hats had to go. The hats went, and there's a whole memo on how hats have to go. No one should wear a hat. So that was for Caroline Slocok. But more importantly, I think a remarkable example, and this is where I'm getting at, of the Women's Committee's increasing assertiveness was the campaign against its own party to protect child benefit from Patrick Jenkins and Geoffrey Howe's 1980 budget cuts. While Geoffrey Howe questioned whether the state had actually been wise to give the allowance to women, thus departing from the idea of the state dealing with the family as a unit headed by the father, the Women's National Advisory Committee believed that universal child benefit should not be devalued because it gave mothers equal power to fathers. And as a result, the clash between the Women's Committee and the parliamentary party was quite important, was important enough to be noticed by the Labour Party in Parliament and used to criticise the Conservatives, the Conservative Party. And I think this is, it's one of the first instances, I'm sure there were others, where you see, one of the first instances in the history of conservatism, where you see conservative women putting their commitment to feminism before their affiliation to the Conservative Party, and that they feel that they need to be more vocal. I should stop there. Time is rolling. Maybe just to conclude, a few words. I think that there are many ways of enacting conservative female activism. There are obviously a diversity of women, but these two examples are there to show that what the historiography has shown, what we've looked at, that this idea that, and I quote, that women were held in a primarily exploitative relationship within the Conservative Party, and their political work, in fact, elided into these sandwich-making, tea-making moments, that we need to look at that more carefully, and I think differently, and look at how, the agency they had, obviously still upholding the gender hierarchy and everything that Julie pointed to. I'm not sure about protecting vulnerable women all the time, but that depends on obviously different moments. And so I think, yes, that's what we need to look at, their agency within the movement. And I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. It was really, really thought-provoking and worked really well together. And I was really struck actually by the emphasis on that both of you are placing on women's roles outside of the parliamentary party. And I think perhaps that when you were talking about the journalists before, they're not understanding that kind of that particular trajectory or the particular roles that women are playing out. You know, that kind of narrow focus on the parliamentary party in conservative politics is really important. I'm very conscious of time. Oh, I'm losing my voice already, and there's 2 days to go. So I'd like to open it out to questions from the audience, if anybody would like to ask our speakers anything. We have our microphones here ready to go. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you for 2 amazing talks, Clarisse and Julie. I think this is, I mean, you both might want to speak to it, but it was a question inspired by Clarisse's talk, and particularly when the members of what had been the Women's Voluntary Services then, are trying to defend their relevance in a post-war moment. And they say they're not like the kind of hit or miss voluntarism of the interwar period. And they also say that the moment of charity and patronage is past, you said. And I was thinking about that in the context of Attlee's characterization of charity as this cold, gray, loveless thing, and saying that the rich ought not to just give their money away on a whim. And I was wondering if you guys could talk more about the way that conservative women saw the relationship between voluntarism and the state, because one of the things about the British welfare state, right, is that there continues to remain a comparatively outsized role for the voluntary sector, and how conservative women in particular viewed that relationship.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's actually, it's a very important question. I think the debate between voluntarism and the state had been ongoing, and in fact the idea that one would replace the other was never going to happen, because there was a need for both, and in fact both had already coexisted. Of course, it wasn't the welfare state as such, but the state had always funded volunteers, and volunteers had been part of state institutions. So in fact, there was a mixed economy of welfare that already existed before the Second World War. I think that's something that the conservative women were very aware of, because precisely they had been to negotiate already funding from the states before. So whereas the Conservative Party hierarchy seemed extremely worried by Clement Attlee, the Labour government, what they were proposing, and felt that it was probably the end of voluntary services as it had existed, they were very confident. That's what I find. They were very confident that that it was just a matter of balance, and balancing it out, and that they had already been doing that without those conservative men really realizing how these associations worked. And so it was just a matter of really pointing it out to them that they were already working like that. So I think that it's but it's a very interesting debate, this moment of will one sort of prevail on the other, and continues all the way to today with the idea of the big society, and we come back to these ideas regularly of how much voluntarism versus state do we want. But I don't know whether you want to say a few words on this.
Thank you. I mean, this is your specialty, and those are really important points that you've made. I'd like to take it back a little bit further, and I think there's a long tradition and a struggle by conservative women in their nationalist-driven associations and their national service associations to get official recognition. So on the one hand, they know that they are giving of their time voluntarily, and that they don't expect remuneration in that sense. But what they do want is official imprimatur. And is to be recognized as a para-state actor, and that is very important. Not to have to have state endorsement, but especially to have royal endorsement on top of that is seen as and that that's from the far right and towards the center of the right. Like the British fascisti is really obsessed with getting that recognition, as are the women police, etc. So they're all kind of so there's so many kind of initiatives which take for granted that they are going to be based on voluntary service, but the only reason to do that is so that they actually get the official recognition and the kudos that they really feel they deserve. So I think that's another kind of aspect to it. And it's interesting how that changes or doesn't with the welfare state, I think, as well.
Thanks. And Jim Tomlinson from Glasgow. Just continuing that theme about voluntarism, I mean, absolutely, what you say about its continuation throughout a whole period of the construction of the welfare state, and how that continues to be very important. Today, of course, we talk about non-governmental organisations, we use slightly different language, but it's clear that it's still very important. But on that, if the Conservatives often tell a story that the welfare state has crowded out the voluntary sector, and that's been a constant worry that they've had, that will indeed be the case. And what gives that a little bit of credence, that fear, is the issue of religion, which neither of you mentioned. It seems to me, if you go back to these women that you're talking about, conservative women of the interwar period, Christianity is enormously important to them and is interwoven with their voluntary action. So I think, in trying to do this great stuff of delineating what the characteristics of these women were, I think you've got to say something about Christianity. I really do think that, and then it does link with your theme of voluntarism.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to bring it back to Londonderry as a specific example, it's interesting that it's during the war itself and after she's kind of been largely discredited because of that she turns very, very, very strongly to religion and to faith, but it's not. It's there, but it's not as kind of defining and as dominant in her ideology and in her activism as the motivation for her activism before then. But in later life and as she's trying to rescue her reputation, then she does. So it's not always as prominent as you might think, and it can often change on an individual basis.
No, thank you for asking. You're absolutely right. In the women's voluntary service is certainly an extremely important element. In fact, in most of the voluntary associations that I look at, and in fact, after the Second World War, many conservative women, so with a big C, from the Conservative Party, actually join the British branch, create actually the British branch of the European Union of Women, in which they actually fight for Christian democracy. And that's a very interesting episode of debate and dialogue with other European parties on the right and Christian democracy. And at the same time as the debate I was talking about, 45-50, there's a debate between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party about what Christian democracy means and whether it's left-wing or right-wing or who's. And Stafford Cripps writes that book, Towards Christian Democracy, in 47, and the Conservatives react to that. And once again, it's really those conservative women around this time, Lady Emmett, and a lot of those women who actually sort of try to think through what it means and whether the Anglican Church can fit in or not. And it's a very interesting debate, yes. Mm-mm.
Hi, thank you very much for your talks. It's given me a lot to think about. I was just wondering if you could speak more about conservative white feminists' engagement with ideas about race, if they did, and how those underpinned their support for the empire, particularly in the earlier period. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge issue here, of course. We take it for granted. They certainly took it for granted that they were, and this was a reaction to, it was a very reactionary position on all questions of race and empire, many of them were, racist, even by the measures of their own time. So yeah, I mean, I think that takes it for granted. But again, that's the interesting and thing that we really struggle to get our heads around. How can they be so progressive, notionally progressive or seemingly progressive on women's issues, but don't question any other inequalities and levels of discrimination. So I think, and I don't think at least the people that I speak about, they never reflected on that problem, and that's I think just the God honest truth about that.
Yes, I can only confirm that, except that maybe just sort of some issues, some campaigns around being against the excision of women or prostitution of women in Africa. So there are sort of moments, very punctual, and which actually would fit in what you were saying about vulnerable women. But that's as far as it really goes, I'm afraid. Yep.
And of course, I mean, it's, you know, in the context of the time I'm speaking about, anti-Semitism is a really important, you know, indicator of the depth of their prejudice. And not only that, they're very, you know, also very anti-German, and, you know, so they manage, as I say, to balance their really deep prejudices and their chauvinisms against still this idea that you know, but again, that feminism they feel very proud of that kind of feminism and that view of feminism as a British quality and tradition, and as the real expression of the metropole.
I'm really conscious of time, and I'm sure that we could continue this really, really interesting discussion, and I hope we'll continue to do so in a more informal way. But I just want to thank very much both of our speakers, Clarisse Berthezene and Julie Gottlieb, and I hope you'll join me in doing so.